Archangel showed a vision. A city, lighter than air.
It's my great pleasure to be joined by Ken Levine, creative director at Irrational Games, of course, the impending BioShock Infinite. I mean, it's done. You're gold. Is that like, I mean, is it a monkey off your back? Is it a weight off your chest?
Yeah, I mean, it's so weird, Adam, because, you know, we saw each other a few months ago, and I was actually pretty much done in terms of my development process back in December, but then you have this whole extended process of, you know, fixing the bugs and submitting to Sony and Microsoft and all that, and then just got to ship to the stores, and you know, so that's really a long period of time, but I've mostly now been, you know, out on the press tour stuff and talking to people about it, but I've sort of been so anxious for actually talking to guys like you who've actually, you know, who could, you know, people who've gotten to the end actually getting their sense of the game.
Yeah.
There's so much there that just we haven't been able to even turn a corner up on for people.
And understandably so. And for the sake of everyone out there, no, we will not be spoiling things right now.
No spoilers.
No spoilers. But yes, I think one of the things that struck me about the game, and this is even when I played the first couple of hours of it, is there's a lot of themes that are going on.
Yeah.
You see it immediately in the idea that Comstock clearly has a vision of America that is far more pure than I think most players will find comfortable. I mean, where was the origin in your mind of Columbia? Was it always a place that had this rather ugly racial sentiment?
I think it was trying to, you know, when we thought of, you know, we started with the White City in the 1893 World's Fair, which was basically a response to France's World's Fair, which the Eiffel Tower was first presented at, and that was supposed to be, you know, wow, look at France, and America was like, well, you know, screw France, we're gonna do something even more awesome, and they built this very idealized place, and they said this is a representation sort of where America is today, and I thought that was really interesting. I don't know if I've seen something quite like that since. And they actually built a city, the White City, and that was basically a temporary city, but glorious in its scale. But you also had, if you read the book, Devil in the White City, you also had one of America's first serial killers was operating in that venue as well. And so you have this darkness within this sort of incredibly optimistic thing. I mean, amongst all this technology and a sense of growing American pride and all that, and it just seemed to be such a great metaphor for one of these stories. But yeah, there's, well, of course there's darkness. There's darkness everywhere.
But it's also this sense of idealization that the America that Comstock seems to be embracing, and you know, and Columbia is somehow more American than America itself. They've decided to separate from it. There's so much sort of self-mythologizing, both of the person in Comstock, in the image of Columbia, and then America, with the idea that, you know, you see Jefferson, you see Ben Franklin, and they're kind of revered as prophets or saints.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a fascinating idea of sort of how a country looks at itself and creates its stories. And was that something that was true to the White City as well?
I think that was a bit of a license on our own part. I think that was more from hearing. I'm a bit of a history nerd, right? So I like reading history.
Evident in the game.
And you know, and when you read a lot of history, and you know, you have to tend to read a lot of history, because if you read one book, you know, if you go read, you know, Max Boot, you'll get one very view of the world, and you go read Howard Zinn, you'll get a very different view of the world. So you tend to have to read a lot of different things and understand everybody brings a viewpoint to it. But what's interesting to me about the founders, the founding fathers of America, is they were people, you know, and they were both remarkable, amazing, incredible people, so far ahead of their time, who did things that would be unthinkable today, like a politician like George Washington stepping down after his first term, where he easily could have become Caesar, you know, and setting the tone for America, or a guy like Thomas Jefferson to writing the Declaration of Independence, and then, you know, Madison, you know, writing, you know, the Bill of Rights and working on the Bill of Rights, and all these people who sort of created all these amazing things, let alone Franklin and his government and his inventions and the post office and, you know, all these incredible things. But they were men of their time. Like, you know, we think of Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, which is actually, they sort of view him in this world of Columbia as a devil, because he changed the nature of the founders' vision in their view. It was freedom for a certain type of person, not everybody. And to be fair, when Lincoln freed the slaves, right, there were still plenty of disenfranchised people.
Yes.
It wasn't like he said everybody gets to vote, everybody gets to be free. There was still lots of disparity there. And if you had asked Lincoln, the man who literally gave his life for emancipation of African Americans, what he thought of African Americans, he would have sounded like the worst white supremacist you've ever met, because he was a man of his time. Almost none of the abolitionists had what you would call a modern view of race. They had a very sort of benighted view of race, but they, even outside of that context, were ahead of their time.
The Angel Columbia did present herself to Father Comstock and show him a vision of the future.
Well, and it's quite impressive. I mean, it was evident in the first BioShock, but quite evident in Infinite that there is story that is told to you, and then there's the story that you just kind of glean information from. Even if you're not listening to an audio log, you're noticing signs on walls, or when you go into the people that revere John Wilkes Booth, the Society of the Raven, I believe.
Yeah.
You're still drawing that narrative. How do you sort of strike that balance where you let the player just kind of figure it out for themselves, and where you actually say, hey, this is happening?
Well, those are some of my favorite moments, like, you know, the two, I don't know if you noticed the two bathrooms at the boardwalk in the beginning.
Oh, yes.
You know, you go through the colored bathrooms, and you go to the white bathrooms, and you could never see, you have to go through the colored bathrooms, or at least the corridor. You don't actually have to go in the bathrooms. And you don't ever have to go to the white person bathrooms. And I love seeing the people who found that, you know, and then just sort of discovered it. And it's not like we say anything about race. We don't say, like, the narrator doesn't come on and say, see how awful it was? It's just more of a subtle thing of, look, this is the way it is, you know. They get the crappy stuff, and those guys get the good stuff. And
then if you actually, if you hang a right, there's a mother with her son who's crying, and she's admonishing him for, I think, stealing kisses from girls with Irish last names.
Yep.
So you just even get that other touch that, you know, even back then it was even more vast. Who was considered to be a disreputable group of people.
No, I mean, there was, I think people, and it's not even that long ago, people, when Kennedy was running, who's Irish Catholic, was running for president, it was shocking to people that an Irish Catholic could become president.
They thought he'd be answering to the Vatican and not to the people of the United States.
He'd be an agent of the Pope. And now it's not even like an issue, but you go back then and you've got, you know, the Catholic Protestant thing was still very, very, you know, a hot button issue back then. And of course, you know, the Chinese and the Jews and the Native Americans and of course the African Americans. It was a racially fraught time.
Now, the fact that there is a game, and I think once again this highlights the issue with calling something a game, because it indicates fun, but you are really investing it with some pretty touchy and sensitive places where video games don't really tread all that frequently. I mean, were you cognizant of that at the get-go, that this was uncharted territory? Was it something that you were excited by?
I don't think like I think of the content like this, oh, we're gonna use this kind of content or that kind of content. I think of a story we want to tell. And this world, you know, this worldview of Comstock's, you know, evolved, you know, as we thought about it. And this notion of him being, you know, sort of a mosaic figure, leading people out of Egypt, you know, to a better place, and what he would call the Sodom below. And like, why? Who were the chosen people in his views? You know, and who were? Because if you look at it, like, I'm of Jewish descent. You know, the notion of the chosen people is incredibly racist, right? You know, like, we're better than everybody else. So, you know, just if you flip that on its head and you put that in the context of a white sort of Protestant, well, at least originally a Protestant, you know, then your sort of back gets up. But you know, in 2 weeks it'll be Passover, and everybody will be talking about the chosen. So I think it's people. That's a pretty common sort of meme. That's why we tend to lean on existing memes like the story of Moses, like the story of Noah. Those play heavily into you know, into sort of Comstock's frame of mind. But you just write the story you want to write, and honestly, the only time you think about, is this good, is this bad, is this in good taste, should we have it or not, is when it affects the experience and takes you out of the story you're trying to tell. The example I give in the original BioShock, for a while, little sisters were like any other AI. You could shoot them and they would die. And we realized very quickly that that is not the story we want to tell. And we got a lot of guff from a lot of fans, like, oh, you dumbed it down, you can't shoot little sisters. I said, the story is not about shooting little sisters. It's about making really it's about making a choice of economics, you know? What is your trade-off? You know, how realpolitik about you are you about your economic system? And that's what Rapture was about. It's like, you know, what are the limitations of an economic system? And so shooting them had nothing to do with it. So I had no problem taking it out because it just would have been a distraction.
And it would kind of, their role in the game was so important that if you could just shoot them, that kind of undermines their central role in the narrative.
Yeah, they become far less important. And there are things you do in games that everything, look, there's, in the same reason you don't have a scene of like, you know, Indiana Jones, you know, gets irritable bowel syndrome and has to spend an hour in the bathroom. That's not relevant to the story. I mean, you could argue at some point, you know, he made all these journeys to Latin America and, you know, maybe he did have a problem with his bowels, you know, and who cares, all right? You know, it's not relevant to the story and doesn't help the story.
So, obviously the American flag and the sort of Comstock's iteration of the American flag that flies all over Columbia, Wounded Knee, all of these elements, and you see the statues to Washington and to Jefferson. Do you see this game as an American game? Is it something that's going to resonate more with people that sort of understand American culture, or is it something sort of broader in terms of its resonance?
I think, you know, fortunately, probably America is the country that has probably more awareness of sort of its history than a lot of other countries in terms of internationally. And I think people are always, there is a sort of degree of interest in the United States because it's, you know, it has, you know, it does, you know, it casts a big shadow. I think that it's, I mean, you got to the end, so I don't want to spoil it for other people.
No,
but
no.
The themes are, at the end of the day, go beyond that, and those are just part of the story. And I think sort of those parts, the notion of America and the notion of like who John Wilkes Booth is and who Thomas Jefferson is, those will obviously have a larger impact on the people who know those things. But in the same way, you know, I think people play Assassin's Creed without any real knowledge of the Italian Renaissance, or, you know, the most recent one, really, of the Revolution. In the same way, did anybody really know about the post-war America period when we did BioShock 1?
Yeah.
You know, or what motivated Orion, you know, the whole, what happened to bourgeoisie families in Russia during the Civil War, what happened during the New Deal, and why that may be frustrating. Like you ask most people about Roosevelt, they'd say, oh, everybody loves Roosevelt. In the same way, if you ask them about Lincoln, everybody loves Lincoln.
But back then, people really didn't.
Yeah. And I think it's rare, like I really liked the film Lincoln that just came out because they actually took the time to talk about him as an actual person, mostly as a politician.
Rather than an icon.
Rather than an icon. And they, you know, did they clean him up a little bit? Probably, because some of the things he said probably would have been so shocking from a racial perspective, just because that was the parlance of the time. But generally they treated him as a politician, not an icon. And that's what he had to do to free the slaves. He had to be a master politician.
Do you sort of see that iconography of history as something that's essential? And I mean, I guess in playing Infinite, you see quite a bit of the danger, but there also seems to be a sense of the inevitable. Like it's going to happen, that history over time will somehow be enshrined in some sort of telling that may not be consistent with what the maker of that history would actually want to have it seen as.
Well, look, I think that, you know, generally, if you look at the arc of political history, the more sanitized it is, generally the more scared you should be.
Yeah.
You go to Stalin and, you know, to use the extremes, you know, you go to North Korea, you know, there is incredibly, you know, these incredibly sanitized images of the leaders and all these stage photos, and you see all those great photos of Kim Jong-il, like at a factory pointing at something and everybody's like taking notes, like, oh, he's really telling us how to make that herring. And, you know, and generally I think that's always a sign of trouble. People, I think the more we sort of understand people, warts and all, I think they're more interesting and they're better. You know, like people have warts, and that's what makes them interesting. People have flaws. Why do we like characters and stories? We like them as often as not for what they're not versus what they are. Well, so Batman's more interesting than Superman.
Exactly. Well, and then on the subject of character, we have Elizabeth, which we're going to be talking about in our next video. So Ken, thank you for your time, but stay right there. For all of you, I hope you enjoyed this. Now go check out some of the other chats that I have with Ken Levine. We're going to be talking about Elizabeth and the remarkable technology that is in BioShock Infinite.